Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. I'm going to wait for a few more people to trickle in first. Okay, for those of you just arriving, I'm just going to give it a few more minutes. I'll probably start around 7:05, maybe a little earlier, depending on when the trickling in of people slows down a little bit, and then I'll turn my camera on and everything. And then someone in the chat asked if their audio is automatically off. And yes, on the webinar, I can't see you or hear you, so we'll interact through the chat. You guys can just see and hear me. And then it's also being live streamed on YouTube. So if you or your friends or other chapter members need it, the chapter DEI chair for each of your individual chapters has that link as well. All right, everybody. We can go ahead and get started now. Hopefully, as people trickle in, they can kind of catch up and see where we are. But for those of you who don't know me or haven't attended a DEI webinar before, my name is Nora, and I currently serve as the Pan-Hellenic Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. This presentation is going to address implicit bias, and I specifically left the part 1 on here because I'm hoping that implicit bias something we continue for years and years to come. And then this is a diversity, equity, and inclusion presentation. At the end of this, there will be a QR code for you to scan and fill out kind of a little questionnaire or feedback form. And I've said this for the last few DEI webinars, but you will have the opportunity if you've attended, this is your 3rd one, and there's one more that will happen right before the semester ends. If you attend all 4, we're going to go through and pick a few random participants and give them a gift card to a locally owned, minority owned business here in Tucson. So that's really exciting. But this will address implicit bias and microaggressions as well. And if you were a recruitment counselor, you might have seen this presentation already. There's some parts that have been changed because implicit bias is super important for recruitment, but I also think that it's really important for the whole community to know. Everybody plays an important role during Panhellenic recruitment, and so I'm excited that we get to talk about this today. So without further ado, we'll get started. This is just a quote that I really like. It's from the National Panhellenic Conference, and they have a whole guide on their website, npc.org, on cultivating a more inclusive recruitment. And I really recommend if you're a newly slated recruitment chair, you're really interested in recruitment, that you check that out because there are lots of different little tweaks that you can make in order to make your chapter's recruitment experience more inclusive for potential new members. So it's just something to chew on. And basically it's that implicit bias is the automatic associations we have unintentionally and unconsciously that impact our actions, behaviors, and understanding. They are associations of stereotypes with people and or situations based on our involuntary attitudes learned over time. So we'll kind of break down what different phrases in this definition are over the next few slides. Also, fun fact, if you're wondering what my background is the Disability Cultural Center here at the University of Arizona. It's their mural, and I definitely recommend that you check them out. That's a little nod to the Cultural Center I'm a part of. Okay, so now let's talk about shared language. So shared language is important because we want to make sure that we're always all on the same page when we talk about things. So for example, if I think explicit bias means one thing and you think explicit bias means another thing, then we might not agree on whatever the situation we're discussing is. And we want to make sure that we all are kind of on the same page and agreeing about the same thing. So that way solutions can be made, one, that are practical, but also solutions can be come up with much more quickly. So first, let's define bias. And bias is a preference for or prejudice against a person or group of people. Explicit bias operates on a conscious level, often arises as the direct result of a perceived threat. The expression of explicit bias would be like hate speech or blatant discrimination, segregation, and this occurs as a result of a deliberate thought. So someone says, I hate a specific minority group, I'm going to spew hate speech against them. That is explicit bias. Implicit bias is a little bit different. It's a little bit trickier to catch. This operates on a subconscious level, and it often runs contrary to your conscious beliefs. It's triggered through automatic mental associations we make between people's ideas, objects, and the attitudes and stereotypes that we hold. So I think one of the most interesting components of implicit bias is that it often runs contrary to your conscious beliefs. So you might think, I have this very strong social justice belief, but your implicit bias may actually be showing something or portraying something that doesn't agree with something that you think that you're very passionate about or that you've advocated for. And so that's why it's really important to always check your own implicit biases. And it's something that we'll get into a little bit more as we go throughout this presentation, but we all have implicit bias. It's there. And that's okay. It's not something that you need to be ashamed of, but it is something that you need to check so you can change and that those implicit biases don't turn into explicit biases. Just a few other helpful definitions that I think will come up throughout this little webinar here are social identities. So social identities are the groups that we fall into and that we associate ourselves with based on the identities that we cannot change. So for instance, I identify as someone that has a physical disability. I can't change that. So that would be kind of a social identity. Social identities can provide people with a sense of self-esteem and a framework for socializing, and it can influence their behavior. Personal identities, on the other hand, encompass our personality traits, things that are special to us and things that make us distinct from other individuals. So these are focused on the individual, they're fluid over time, self-categorization. So for example, I love Taylor Swift. I hope you all are enjoying her new version of Red, but I would self-categorize my personality or my personal identity as a Swiftie. And then lastly, to unlearn something. So we've all learned things from the minute we were born up until right now. And sometimes we have to unlearn things. And that can be really tricky. But to unlearn something is to discard something that you have learned, especially a bad habit or false or outdated information from your memory. So it's something that you do not want to reference at this point forward. Okay, so now we're going to play a little bit of a word association game. I'm going to have you guys participate through the chat. And I probably won't go through all of these, but basically I want us to think of words that we think of when we hear these words. And we'll do sorority, and then maybe we'll do like relationships and friendships. So if in the chat you can say a few words that come to mind when you think of the word sorority, that would be greatly appreciated. I'll give you guys a few minutes to do that. Okay, so I'm seeing unity and sisterhood, community, lifelong friendships, strong women, deep bonds, support, sisterhood, women, family, empowering, go back down, community. These are all great. And I love how much I'm seeing unity at college. That's a really great example. Love, but then exclusivity, and not necessarily in a bad way, but they're definitely exclusive. Yeah, that's actually exactly what I wanted to say. I wanted to see some positives and some negatives, because those are true. And we can't, get rid of all of the negative ones, but we can work to make sure that we focus on the positive ones. And it seems as though white girls is another one. We're not very diverse. It's something that we can work on. When we're in our community, we don't really focus on the negative, right? We tend to focus on the positive. And so I think by checking our implicit biases and making sure that we always commit to doing so, we can shift away from those negative stereotypes like exclusivity. We can watch our microaggressions that show up during recruitment season, and that inherently can make us more inclusive, which is really good. So thank you for participating in that. I won't make us do any more words, but I think that's a really good example of what we're striving for. Okay, so like I mentioned, we all have implicit bias, but how exactly does this relate to recruitment? Well, recruitment is a highly interactive process and is comprised of first impressions after first impressions. You're meeting new people all the time, all day long. When we experience new things, our brains go into overdrive and implicit bias invites itself in. So we all have brains, we all experience new things every single day, and it makes sense that we all have those implicit biases. It is important to separate implicit and explicit, however. And just because we have implicit biases, it doesn't mean that we can't control them. So implicit biases do not equal assumptions. So to have implicit bias is normal, but we have a responsibility to keep it in check. So for example, something that a potential new member may say to you may lead you to have a certain thought. This thought might pop into your head based on what you've previously seen or learned throughout your life, but all it is just that, a thought. You never should be assuming anything about anyone, potential new member, a fellow sister, anyone. Ask nicely or keep it to yourself sometimes. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Okay, so now let's go over a few steps to checking our own implicit biases. So if we don't act now, our implicit biases will find their way out of our brains and into our actions and understanding. So what is our understanding of things? Well, understanding is the ability to empathetically and sympathetically be aware of others' experiences. we don't want our implicit biases to be so ingrained that we now feel like we understand them or relate to them. They should be, again, just a thought or something that you want to unlearn. So notice it, apologize, and commit to being better next time. And we'll go into kind of how you can achieve each of those steps in a minute here. But it's also important to remember that activism is a way and not a hobby. So while it's great to go ahead and throw something up on your Instagram story, that's fantastic. It is awareness and it's something that you definitely should still do. It's also equally as important to go out and do an actionable item such as voting or volunteering somewhere. Okay, so we've noticed that we can check our implicit biases. We've gone over that that's something that we can do. We have the ability to do, but implicit bias can still emerge. So when does this happen? Well, it's likely to emerge throughout our conversations with potential new members, and we have to acknowledge and attempt to block those automatic associations. Another area that implicit bias tends to show up is with matching during recruitment. So this would be matching girls based on race or matching girls even based on something like a hobby. So for instance, if you match somebody that you know is a leader in your sorority with someone that has a lot of leadership experience from high school, that's great. And having leadership experience is important and it's a value that we want to meet women based on. But we also have to remember that the ability to have lots of leadership experience comes with the ability that you have time to devote to these other things. Maybe somebody had to work a job in high school and couldn't be president of the choir. Maybe somebody had to take care of their younger sister or brother at home, and they didn't have time to run track after school. So we have to take all of those activities with a grain of salt and remember that they're not really values as much as something that a person enjoys doing. And commitment to something else is definitely a value, and so you don't need to disregard those things completely, but it's just something to keep in mind. Really, whoever is matching or managing the matching process is also likely to experience implicit bias that needs to be checked and not acted on. So having, the person that is in charge of recruitment for your chapter, check in with the matcher, make sure that things are going smoothly, or having a co-facilitator who's managing the matching process with you is also something that would be beneficial. And that way, you guys are making sure, we're not matching someone inappropriately. Having a team that does it, that's another great option. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about microaggressions. So a microaggression is a statement, an action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. I know that's a bit of a mouthful of a definition, but microaggressions and implicit bias go hand in hand. So essentially, a microaggression is kind of an implicit bias that's escaping. All of a sudden, you're like, oh, I didn't mean to say that, or I didn't mean to do that. And maybe it was unintentional, maybe it was indirect, maybe it was a little passive aggressive and it was intentional. There are things that we want to avoid. So examples of these include saying to someone, you speak good English. That kind of implies that you aren't American, and that's just not true. Or when I look at you, I don't see color. You might think that what you're saying is really nice and that you're trying to explain to them that, you don't see them as a different race or as different than you, but that denies a person of color their racial and ethnic experience, and they should be able to share that experience with you. Another one, so who's the man in the relationship? This implies that a normal relationship must involve a man and a woman. It couldn't involve two men or two women or non-binary individuals. We want to make sure that we're not really using that phrase anymore. And speaking of little microaggressions that come up during recruitment and also that involve something like this or gender is when we have recruitment outfits, if you have everybody in your chapter wearing a dress, that kind of is a microaggression because you don't know if somebody is uncomfortable wearing a dress. So making sure that you have a gender neutral option that you can wear, that you're not so set in your ways about it has to be this exact outfit or this dress is a really great way to make the recruitment experience more inclusive for your recruiters, who are why our chapters and why our community continues to grow, and who are equally as important as our potential new members. Okay, so back during the first semester, or last semester, spring of 2021, I did a presentation on intent versus impact, and that comes up in every conversation and every DEI webinar that we hold. But it's important to know the difference. It's important to acknowledge that many times we are well-intentioned in our actions. Even when our implicit biases are affecting our comments and behaviors, we still are likely not consciously hurting or stereotyping anyone. However, the reality is our intent does not invalidate our impact. We do not get to decide how something makes somebody else feel, and we must take responsibility for the impact our actions and behaviors have on others and other situations. And that's really important, and that's why you must be checking your implicit biases. Every time you have a situation, maybe it's a little bit of a difficult situation, you're having a deep discussion with another member in your chapter, another member in the community, think before you speak, think after, reflect. Did I say something that maybe came out wrong? How can I go apologize and then make sure I don't do that the next time? Okay, this activity is not something that you're all required to do, but I wanted to provide the QR code with you all, just in case it's something that you were curious about. I'll also provide it with your individual chapter diversity, equity, and inclusion chairs. I'll give them this whole presentation so that they can go over this with you if they choose to do that. But this is an implicit association test. It's from Harvard University. And this tests your own hidden biases. So there's like a lot of different categories. There's one about race, there's one about disabilities, one about sexual orientation. And basically, they're only suggested interpretation. So take it with a grain of salt. Don't think if it tells you, you're a bad person, which it wouldn't say that anyway, that you are. But think of this as a starting point to kind of unlearn what you do know and then learn what you don't. I want to leave you all with a quote that I think is important to me. That's by Maya Angelou, and it says, if you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't fight for what's right, but it does mean that if you see something in yourself that you're not happy with and you don't know how to change it, try changing your perspective, try changing your attitude up. Try checking those implicit biases and you'll feel better. This, as we kind of get out of the diversity, equity, and inclusion content, something that I want to make all of you aware of. Please share it with as many people as you know, non-Greek or Greek. But my last webinar that was supposed to be delivered to all of you was scheduled to take place on December 2nd at December. This is the wrong date on here. It's December 2nd, not the 5th. But it will be from 5:30 to 8:30 p.m. That webinar will be recorded and put in the December newsletter. And instead, we will be hosting this community wellness event. It will actually be at the Kachina Lounge. So that's flyer can use some updating, but in your Panhellenic delegates will have information on it. But basically, we want you all to come join the Panhellenic Executive Board as we celebrate our community. Bring study materials and come prepared to leave with mental wellness and study resources. Hot chocolate and cookies and popcorn will be provided. Again, all are welcome, non-Greek members included. Anyone from any council is welcome to come. We really want to establish community. We talk a lot about Panhellenic love, and we want to showcase that that really is a true thing. Okay, and then finally, as always, contact me with any questions, comments, concerns that you may have. My email is listed on the screen, uapanhellenic.inclusion@gmail.com. This is the QR code for that little survey that I'll have you all fill out at the end so I can track attendance. And then, because 50% of your chapters are expected to attend or watch at least at the recording and then fill this out. So fill it out. If you have any questions, again, reach out to me. And thank you all for coming. I hope you all have a very happy Thanksgiving break.